World-famous Christian author and pastor has been in a traffic wreck in East Texas.
The one thing that I appreciate with my dad, not only being a minister, but an amazing father behind closed doors. He was a great dad, really was.
In 1965, a skinny preacher from Pennsylvania stood up and described a future so dark that his own community laughed him out of the room. They called him a fearmonger. They pulled his books from store shelves. They said he had lost his mind completely. Then, one by one, the things he described started showing up in real life. Television networks airing filth at midnight. Churches ordaining what he warned about. Families breaking apart in ways he had already named. And what people are reading from that old prophecy in 2026 is leaving them cold. The watchman whose warnings refuse to die. Right now, in 2026, a strange thing is happening across social media platforms. Old sermons from a dead preacher are pulling millions of views on TikTok. Hashtags like the 1973 vision and David Wilkerson prophecy are climbing the trending lists week after week. Charisma magazine has run 6 different articles about him since November 2024, and the most recent one, published on January 19, 2026, is titled 5 Signs of David Wilkerson's 1973 Vision Continues to Unfold. Perry Stone dropped a video about the man in November 2025 and pulled in massive numbers within days. Even Father's Heart Ministry put out a viral blog post in September 2025, asking why we championed Charlie Kirk, but forgot David Wilkerson. The pattern is impossible to ignore now. Every time another crisis hits the headlines, his name comes flooding back into Christian discourse like a tide that refuses to recede. In Germany, the manufacturing sector has collapsed across 2024 and 2025. Factories are shutting down. Volkswagen has announced layoffs that would have seemed unthinkable a decade ago. Wilkerson wrote in 1973 that the economic crisis would hit Europe first before spreading to Japan, the United States, and Canada. He used the words total economic confusion in capital letters. Reading those words today feels like reading tomorrow's newspaper printed half a century early. But here is what the believers do not always tell you. Wilkerson also predicted things that never happened at all. He said in 1992 that 1,000 fires would burn in New York City the following year. The next year came and went without a single matching event. He said in 1994 that gospel television networks would all collapse within 5 years. Today, TBN, CBN, and Daystar are larger and richer than they have ever been in their entire history. This is the puzzle that no one has fully solved. How can one man be so right about some things and so wrong about others? And why is the world suddenly listening to him again? 15 years after his violent death on a Texas highway? The answer takes us back to the ordinary morning when everything in his life turned upside down inside the pages of a single magazine. The magazine drawing that changed everything. David Ray Wilkerson was born on May 19, 1931, in Hammond, Indiana. His grandfather was an Assemblies of God minister, and his father was one too. The family eventually settled in Turtle Creek and then Barnesboro in Pennsylvania, where the home was filled with Bibles and rules. Movies were forbidden. Sporting events were forbidden. Even owning a washing machine was considered worldly by his strict grandparents. By the age of 14, young David was already preaching in small country chapels. By 21, he was ordained. He married Gwen Caruso in 1953 and took a small pastorate in Phillipsburg, Pennsylvania, where his congregation was just a few dozen people. He suffered from chronic ulcers throughout his early adult years, which kept him underweight at barely 120 pounds his whole life. He looked more like a hospital patient than a preacher when he stood behind his small wooden pulpit each Sunday. Then came the night of February 9, 1958. Wilkerson felt prompted to give up watching television and pray instead during those late evening hours. He sold his television set the very next day and turned that empty time into long sessions of prayer in his small parsonage. 2 weeks later, on the night of February 24th, he opened that week's issue of Life magazine and saw a courtroom sketch on pages 30 and 31. 7 teenagers were on trial for the death of 15-year-old Michael Farmer, a polio survivor who had been stabbed and beaten to death in Highbridge Park in Washington Heights. The killers were members of a Brooklyn gang called the Egyptian Dragons. They had walked away from Farmer's broken body, wiping blood from their hair and bragging about messing him good. Wilkerson stared at the eyes of one boy in that drawing for so long that something inside him gave way completely. He believed God was telling him to go and help those boys directly. His youth director, Miles Hoover, drove with him 350 miles to Manhattan the following morning. They walked into the courtroom of Judge Irwin Davidson on February 28, 1958. Davidson had already received multiple death threats during the trial and was on edge throughout each session. When Wilkerson stood up, holding his Bible and asking for permission to address the defendants, court officers grabbed him immediately and threw him out into the street. Photographers caught the moment in sharp black and white, and by the next morning, his face was on the front page of New York's tabloids under the label of the Bible preacher who interrupted the gang trial. Most men would have driven home in shame and never returned, but the photograph turned out to be the key that opened every door in the city. Gang members on street corners started recognizing him from the newspaper picture, calling out, "Hi, you preach," and "You're one of us, Davy." The mockery had given him an entry pass to a world no preacher had ever been able to reach. That is when he met the boy who would either kill him or change him forever. The warlord who could not sleep for 2 weeks. Nicky Cruz was the warlord of the Mau Maus, a Brooklyn street gang considered the most violent in New York. The first time Wilkerson approached him on a sidewalk, Cruz cursed him, slapped him in the face, and spat on him. He threatened to cut him into pieces with his knife. Wilkerson did not flinch. Looking at Cruz directly, he said the words that would follow him for the rest of his life. "You could cut me up into 1,000 pieces and lay them in the street, and every piece will still love you." Cruz later described that moment in a CBN interview decades later. He said the words did damage to him in a good way, both in his brain and in his heart. For 2 weeks afterwards, he could not sleep at night because he kept thinking about love. He had grown up in Puerto Rico, in a household where his mother told him he was the son of the devil. He had never heard anyone say they loved him before. The words from a skinny preacher on a Brooklyn sidewalk hit him in a place he did not even know existed inside him. In July 1958, 65 Assemblies of God churches in metropolitan New York pooled their funds and rented the St. Nicholas Boxing Arena for a 5-night rally. On the final night, Wilkerson stood under the lights and gave the same kind of altar call he had given in tiny Pennsylvania churches. Dozens of gang members came forward, including Nicky Cruz himself and Israel Narvaez, both Brooklyn gang leaders. Cruz fell on his knees and felt what he later described as a rushing wind taking his breath away. Cruz went on to enroll at the Latin American Bible Institute in California. He became an evangelist and the author of Run, Baby, Run, a memoir that has sold millions of copies. The Wall Street Journal in 1998 called him the Billy Graham of the streets. Wilkerson's autobiography of these years, The Cross and the Switchblade, was co-written with John and Elizabeth Sherrill, longtime editors at Guideposts magazine. It came out through Pyramid Books in 1963. It went on to sell more than 15 million copies in over 30 languages, and Christianity Today eventually ranked it among the top 50 books that shaped American evangelicals. The 1970 film starring Pat Boone as Wilkerson and a young Eric Estrada as Cruz introduced the story to mainstream audiences across the country and around the world. In December 1960, Wilkerson had bought a property at 416 Clinton Avenue in Brooklyn and opened the first Teen Challenge Center. That little brownstone has now grown into a global recovery network with more than 1,400 centers across 129 countries. The names on the walls of those centers include former addicts, former cartel runners, former prostitutes, and former gang members who would have been buried in their 20s without that quiet brick building in Clinton Hill. But none of this fame protected him from what was about to happen. By 1973, he was about to publish something that would turn his entire community against him almost overnight, and he had no idea the storm was already coming. the vision that burned his reputation to the ground. In 1971, Wilkerson moved his ministry headquarters from New York to Lindale, Texas, and founded an umbrella organization called World Challenge. The Texas relocation was supposed to be a quieter season for the family. Gwen had already been diagnosed with cancer twice by this point, and she was struggling privately with deep depression that almost nobody outside the family knew about. Their daughters, Bonnie and Debbie, would later face cancer too. Gary Wilkerson, the son who would eventually inherit the ministry, later admitted in his 2014 biography of his father that David sometimes shook his fists at God and asked why he allowed such hurt in this world. Then, in April 1973, during a late-night prayer session in his Texas study, Wilkerson said he received a divine vision of catastrophes coming to the world. He spent the next several months writing it down in long bursts of urgent dictation, often working past midnight. The book came out in February 1974 through Pyramid Books and Fleming H. Revel. It was titled simply The Vision, and the cover line called it a terrifying prophecy of doomsday that is starting to happen now. The book was organized into 5 major sections: economic confusion, weather changes and earthquakes, a flood of filth, the #1 youth problem of the future, and persecution madness. Readers later counted around 336 distinct predictions packed into its dense pages. He named specific industries that would suffer. He named specific moral collapses by category. He named specific behaviors of the future church. The reaction from his own community was savage. David Duplessis, the Pentecostal elder known as Mr. Pentecost, denounced the book in New Covenant magazine in January 1974. He compared it to false prophecies he had heard as a young man about Stalin ruling the world. Christian bookstores across the country pulled the book from their shelves. Wilkerson later admitted that thousands of readers threw the vision down in anger. He had become a pariah overnight, condemned as a fearmonger by the same Pentecostal world that once celebrated him as one of its brightest voices. Pentecostal pastors told him personally that his message had wrecked their building programs because their church boards now refused to take on debt during what they believed was a coming depression. Demos Shakarian's Full Gospel Businessmen's Fellowship, which had once featured him as a star speaker at their luxurious banquets, quietly distanced itself from him. He was no longer welcome at the same prosperity events that had once flown him in first class. But the strangest part of the story was still ahead. Because, as the years passed, some of those rejected predictions started looking very different in the rearview mirror. The words that came true and the words that did not. The economic chapter of the vision is where defenders make their strongest case. Wilkerson wrote that worldwide economic confusion was just ahead, that it would strike Europe first and then affect Japan, the United States, Canada, and other nations shortly after. He predicted a false economic boom before the collapse, severe damage to the auto industry, credit debt becoming uncontrollable, and gold rising astronomically. He even wrote that there would develop a call for revamping all world monetary systems into one uniform system. The euro currency did not exist when he wrote that line. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, Lehman Brothers collapsed on September 15th. General Motors and Chrysler both went through bankruptcy the following year. Credit card debt spiraled across American households to levels that economists had never seen before. Gold climbed from around $106 an ounce in 1973 to a peak of $1,921 in September 2011. The European debt crisis did exactly what he had predicted, beginning in Greece and rippling outward across the continent. His moral predictions also kept landing one by one. He warned that pornography would be piped directly into homes through cable networks after midnight. That happened in the 80s and then exploded with the internet in the 90s. He predicted that students would be taught homosexual love is normal, that gay and lesbian ministers would be ordained into church leadership, and that television comedies would mock Christ on a regular basis. The Episcopal Church consecrated its first openly gay bishop in 2003. Same-sex marriage became the law of the land in 2015 through Obergefell versus Hodges. Family Guy and South Park have built entire episodes around mocking Christianity. In 1985, Wilkerson published "Set the trumpet to thy mouth," and predicted God would clean house among televangelists involved in sexual sin and financial corruption. According to evangelist Mike Evans, Wilkerson personally hand-delivered a letter that year to Reverend Richard Dortch, who was then running PTL under Jim Bakker. The letter said that within 12 months, judgment would fall on PTL Ministries. The Charlotte Observer broke the Bakker scandal involving Jessica Hahn in March 1987, almost exactly 12 months later. Jimmy Swaggart's confession involving Deborah Murphy followed on February 21, 1988, with millions of dollars and entire empires crumbling on national television. Yet, the failures are equally specific. On September 7, 1992, Wilkerson preached a sermon at Times Square Church, declaring that 1,000 fires would burn in New York City the following year. He said federal troops would have to move in, tanks would run down avenues, and Broadway would shut down completely. 1993 came and went peacefully. In a December 1994 newsletter, he wrote that within 5 years, all gospel television networks would fall into bankruptcy and absolute ruin. By 1999, every single one of them was thriving and expanding into new markets. In April 2000, after the stock market dropped 618 points in a single day, Wilkerson wrote in capital letters that the crash was inevitable and nothing could stop it. Within 7 days, the market had hit fresh record highs. He came closer to admitting fault here than anywhere else in his career. In a follow-up letter dated May 22, 2000, he wrote that he had told the Lord he was ready to confess he was wrong, and that when the market reached record highs, he wondered if those calling him a false prophet were right. He never issued a clean retraction of any specific failed prediction in writing, and his next major prophetic moment was about to arrive at the worst possible time. 3 days after he was already wrong by 1 day on the most important call of his life. The blog post that hit the internet at the wrong moment. By 2009, the global financial crisis had buried millions of homes underwater. Foreclosure signs were going up on entire suburban blocks. Banks that had stood for over a century were collapsing in single afternoons. Unemployment was climbing toward double digits in some American states. The mood across the country was rising panic, and Wilkerson was watching all of it from his Texas ranch. On the morning of March 7th, he sat down and published one of the most explosive blog posts of his entire career. The headline screamed in capital letters that an earth-shattering calamity was about to happen and that even the godliest among us would tremble. He said America was now under God's wrath. He repeated his vision of 1,000 fires consuming New York City, New Jersey, and Connecticut. He warned of riots and looting in Times Square. He told followers to stockpile 30 days of non-perishable food, toiletries, and other essentials inside their homes immediately. The post detonated across the internet within hours. WorldNet Daily picked it up. Christian Post ran it. Drudge linked to it on the front page of his aggregator. People who had never heard the name David Wilkerson were suddenly arguing about him in office break rooms and at family dinner tables across the country. Pastor John Piper of Desiring God responded the same day with measured doubt, writing that the food storage advice did not smell authentic to him and reminded him too much of the embarrassing Y2K excesses. He ended his response with the line, "Stick with the Bible, David." Roberto Rivera of Prison Fellowship was much harsher, calling the message rhetorical nonsense. The timing turned out to be devastating. The S&P 500 had hit its intraday low of 666.79 on March 6th, exactly 1 day before Wilkerson posted his warning to the world. The closing low of 676.53 came on March 9th, 2 days after the post. From that bottom, the American stock market began the longest bull run in its history. None of the riots came. The 1,000 fires never appeared. The empty grocery stores remained fully stocked through the entire decade. For people who had stockpiled food and emptied bank accounts in panic, the embarrassment was real and lasting for years afterwards. For Wilkerson's defenders, the explanation was simple. Mercy had been extended to America for a season, and judgment had only been delayed. For his critics, the failure became another item on a growing list of warnings that never arrived. He kept preaching at Times Square Church and writing his newsletters, but the magic had drained out of his prophetic voice forever. The internet was now full of articles dissecting his record in cold detail, line by line, and prediction by prediction. Pastors who once defended him began quietly distancing themselves, and seminary students started using his career as a cautionary case study. Then, on Wednesday, April 27, 2011, around 1 in the afternoon, Wilkerson was driving eastbound on U.S. Highway 175 near the Neches River Bridge, outside the small Texas town of Cuney. His car drifted across the center line and slammed head-on into an 18-wheeler driven by 38-year-old Frederick Braggs of Beaumont. The truck went off the bridge into a dry riverbed below. Braggs was treated and released from East Texas Medical Center the same afternoon. Wilkerson, who was not wearing a seatbelt, was pronounced dead at the scene. Gwen, sitting beside him with her seatbelt fastened, survived with a broken hip. Some online voices later whispered about self-harm because of the missing seatbelt and the strange timing of his final blog post. There is no evidence anywhere to support that theory. The Texas Department of Public Safety filed it as a routine fatal collision with no suspicious circumstances attached to it. Gwen would die of cancer the following July, and the family asked the public for privacy during their double season of grief. That morning, just hours before getting into the car for that final drive, Wilkerson had quietly published his very last blog post on his ministry website. Nobody noticed it at first because his posts went out almost daily, and there was no reason to think this one was different. Nobody noticed it until he was already gone, and then the entire internet started reading it at once. The final words that refused to be forgotten. The last post Wilkerson ever published was titled, "When All Means Fail." The closing words read like someone speaking directly from beyond the grave to anyone walking through a dark valley. He wrote that weeping would last through some dark and awful nights, but in that darkness, the Father would whisper that he was with them. The line that hit hardest came next. It was no accident. It was no failure on your part. Hold fast. Let me embrace you in your hour of pain. When readers found those words after the news of his death broke, the post took on a weight that has not lifted in 15 years. People shared it on Facebook. Pastors quoted it from their pulpits. Strangers printed it out and hung it on hospital walls. The man had somehow written his own final benediction without knowing it, and the timing felt impossible to explain through coincidence alone. His brother, Don Wilkerson, delivered the most quietly devastating tribute at the funeral on May 2, 2011, at Rose Heights Church of God in Tyler. When asked what it was like living in the shadow of such a famous brother, Don answered with just 4 words. David cast no shadow. Around 800 people attended in person. Nicky Cruz, the warlord turned evangelist, said that without Wilkerson, he would be in the pit of hell right now. Cruz himself had grown gray-haired and gentle by then, but his voice cracked when he tried to describe what the skinny preacher had meant to him on that Brooklyn sidewalk all those years ago. The public memorial at Times Square Church on May 14th drew thousands in person, with up to 1 million more watching online through a webcast streamed in 10 different languages. The night he died, his name climbed into the top 10 trending topics on Twitter, alongside global news stories and celebrity scandals. Then came the revival nobody expected. In April 2020, evangelist Mike Evans posted on his Jerusalem Prayer Team Facebook page what he claimed was a 1986 Wilkerson plague prophecy about bars, churches, and government shutting down across the world. The post spread like wildfire during the COVID pandemic. People shared it as proof that Wilkerson had seen the pandemic coming decades in advance. But Times Square Church stated they were not aware of Pastor David ever writing those words in any of his books or sermons. Wilkerson's own niece, Julie Wilkerson Close, wrote on Twitter that the quote had been pieced together by someone who took bits of his real prophecies to manufacture a new one. PolitiFact rated the claim false on April 24, 2020. Mario Murillo confirmed that no one close to David Wilkerson had ever heard him say the quote. And yet Mike Evans went on to promote a new book called A Great Awakening is Coming, which was featured on Fox News during the same window of viral attention. That episode revealed something uncomfortable about the modern Wilkerson resurrection. The man himself was complicated, fallible, and at times spectacularly wrong. But in death, he has become a brand that other people can monetize without his permission and without much accountability. His real words are mixed with manufactured words, his real predictions are mixed with embroidered claims, and the line between honor and exploitation has blurred almost beyond recognition. His son, Gary, now leads World Challenge from Colorado Springs and tries to keep the original ministry focused on its roots. Tim DeLina, whose father Paul was the police captain in the Cross and the Switchblade and the treasurer of the very first Teen Challenge, became senior pastor of Times Square Church on May 5, 2020. The two ministries are larger than ever in pure numbers, even as the founder's prophetic legacy keeps splintering into 100 different versions of itself. Times Square Church today draws over 10,000 attendees weekly from more than 100 nationalities, with 900 home satellite fellowships worldwide and streaming reaching over 200 countries. Global Teen Challenge serves 20,000 people across 129 countries. World Challenge supports 37,000 people across 37 nations. The brick building at 416 Clinton Avenue is being preserved as a memorial library, with plans to recreate the 1958 courtroom scene for visitors. Wilkerson himself rejected the title of prophet his whole life. He preferred to call himself a watchman, someone who sees the enemy at the gate and shouts a warning that may or may not be heard. The Bible's own standard from Deuteronomy chapter 18 says a true prophet must be perfect, while 1 Corinthians chapter 13 says we only know in part and prophesy in part. Both passages remain in the same book, and people will keep arguing over which one applies to a man like him. What is undeniable is that the skinny preacher from Pennsylvania who once interrupted a gang trial has refused to disappear from public memory. Every recession brings him back. Every cultural shift brings him back. Every plague, every protest, every moral panic pulls his name back into the conversation, whether his family wants it there or not. He is now both a saint and a question mark, both a comfort and a warning, both a man who got things right and a man who got things wrong. Maybe the real lesson is not whether every line he wrote was perfectly accurate. Maybe the real lesson is that a 120-pound preacher with ulcers, a depressed wife, and no platform can still shake the world from a small Pennsylvania parsonage if he is willing to walk into a New York courtroom alone with nothing but a Bible in his hand. Maybe that is the part of his story that nobody can manufacture or monetize, no matter how many fake quotes go viral on Facebook. What do you think after hearing all of this? Drop your honest thoughts in the comments below.